So today we're finishing up the book of Genesis. Last stories of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis, and then Wednesday we'll be going straight to the book of Exodus. So first, some general patterns. I may have remarked on some of these general patterns earlier, but now's a good time to reflect on them. So here we have the stories of the book of Genesis. First observation is the book of Genesis is an anonymous book. From one end of the book of Genesis to the other, the author does not reveal himself, herself, themselves. Right? We, through our inveterate cleverness and sophistication, we can detect in the book of Genesis different voices. We call that different sources, different documents. And either you are or are not convinced by our ability to reconstruct these lost documents. But at the end of the day, if you are a traditionalist and you think Moses wrote the book, or you're an addict of modern Bible scholarship and you think R is responsible for the book, we all have to admit both Moses and R concealed themselves. Right? The book, as we have it, is anonymous. The next observation is that in the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible, all 24 books, or 39 books of worth, whenever you have a historical book, it's anonymous. Later Jews, and following them later Christians, thought that Joshua wrote the book of Joshua, and Samuel wrote the book of Samuel, right? And Jonah wrote the book of Jonah, and so on. But these books are anonymous. We have the later belief, the idea that Moses wrote the Torah is a belief that appears nowhere in the Torah itself. We understand the basis on which this belief develops, and we'll see that clearly when we get to the book of Deuteronomy. But in the meantime, we have to acknowledge that that belief itself is outside the Torah. Because the Torah is a historical narrative. In Hebrew Bible, all historical narratives are anonymous. Unlike, in contrast with prophetic books, which are, as a rule, the editorial frame is anonymous, but the material is ascribed to named prophets. The vision of Isaiah, the words of Jeremiah. It wasn't such and such a year that the word of the Lord came to. Then we have a vision attributed to named authorities. So this is an interesting stylistic point. Perhaps we have time, but at some other point we could talk about this. Why this is so. Why are historical narratives anonymous? So Genesis is an anonymous narrative like all biblical historical narratives. Next, the narrator, although anonymous, the narrator is omniscient. The narrator knows what happens. Even the most secret thoughts, the secret dreams, when only God is there, no one else. The narrator knows exactly what God said, did, thought. Adam has a private conversation with God, the narrator knows it. Cain and Abel have a private conversation, the narrator knows it. Avimelech, king of Gerar, has a dream, the narrator knows it. The narrator knows everything. This is an omniscient narrator. Now, is the narrator omniscient because the narrator is God? Question mark? Well, if you are a traditionalist, then yes. You say, well, the very fact the narrator knows everything is proof this is written not by a normal human narrator, but by, or perhaps the hand of Moses, but the mind of God. If you are a modern reader, you would say, no, the narrator is omniscient, just as the narrator is in David Copperfield. Or A Tale of Two Cities, you have an omniscient narrator. It's a literary persona. The narrator knows all these things because we expect an omniscient narrator, as opposed to other kinds of narratives where you, the reader, learn what's going on along with the narrator. Like detective stories is a typical format for that narrative. Right? You and the narrator find out at the end that Butler did it. But you don't know that at the beginning, you only know that on page 258. That's a different kind of narrator. So the biblical narrators are always omniscient narrators. They know everything. Next point. So that's true in the book of Genesis, and it's true everywhere. Back to the book of Genesis and these stories. We have narratives more than we have a narrative, singular. We have episodes, stories that are strung along one after the other. We have Abraham stories. Then we have Isaac stories, actually very few Isaac stories, maybe Isaac's story. Then we have Jacob stories. And then we have the Joseph narrative. The Abraham, Isaac, Jacob stories are a series of episodes. They don't really cohere as a organic composition. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. You could take the episodes and move them around, and you wouldn't notice any difference. You could take them out altogether, and you would never realize something is missing. You could stick in another episode, and I would be hard-pressed to identify what exactly is biblical, what exactly is post-biblical. Why this is so, I'm not entirely sure. The contrast is, when you get to the book of the Joseph story, which I asked you to read for today, the Joseph story is a narrative. There clearly is a narrative who begins with a clear literary plan and purpose, and one can see anticipations, harbingers, foreshadowings, references back, artistic composition. You can see all that before you in the Joseph narrative. It's qualitatively different, such that the Joseph story is an organic composition, so when something else gets stuck in, it sticks out. Boy, that was a terrible sentence, but you know what I'm saying. When you have additions to narrative, they stand out precisely because they're not part of this flowing narrative. And in this section, just before and in the middle of the Joseph narrative, are two of the most striking self-contained episodes in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 34, the rape of Dinah, or in English, Dinah, and then chapter 38, Judah and Tamar. I did not ask you to read these two stories because they are so striking, they will immediately absorb all your attention, and you will not pay any attention to what came before it or after it. Right? That's how much they interrupt what's going on. So if you take them out, the interesting point is you won't miss them. You'll have no idea that you just missed something if you skip over chapter 34 or chapter 38. So we have here an interesting artistic technique of the narrator, who strings along episodes, whereas the Joseph narrator seems to have a different literary style. How do I explain that? I don't know how we explain that, or why there is such a difference in contrast. Okay, so this interesting compare and contrast style. The narrator of Genesis 37 through 50 versus the narrator of Abraham from chapter 12 through chapter 36. Don't know. Okay, those are some larger reflections on biblical narrative. Okay, as seen in the book of Genesis, but characteristic of larger stretches of terrain than just the book of Genesis. Now let's talk specifically about the book of Genesis. Footnote, if you want to read Genesis 34 and Genesis 38, you can. Okay? You know, you needed an adult warning sticker on both of them because one has violence and one has sex. Actually, they both have sex. Now for sure you're going to read it. Okay, let's talk about the themes and patterns in the book of Genesis. One theme or pattern that we detect in the book of Genesis is what has been called the barren matriarch tradition. So the patriarchs are the forefathers, the founding fathers, so the matriarchs are the founding mothers. And there seems to be a common problem for these founding mothers, that they have trouble conceiving. That's true of Sarah, wife of Abraham. It's true of Rebekah, wife of Isaac. And it's true of Rachel, the favorite wife of Jacob. And this theme continues forward into the Bible, past the book of Genesis. We have Hannah, mother of Samuel, mother of the prophet Samuel. She is another barren matriarch. New Testament readers will be familiar with this motif also from the Gospel of Luke, the infancy Gospels, the mother of John the Baptist, and the book of Isaiah seems to refer back to this motif, this barren matriarch motif. Rania kara lo yalada. Rejoice, O woman who has no children, who has not yet given birth. The city of Jerusalem, its desolation, is like that of the barren matriarch, who will yet bring forth issue. Why we have this motif, what this motif means, is not so obvious, or it's not so clear. What is the point of this motif? At least Luke understands the motif to be that, look at the power of God. Even a barren woman, through the mercy power of God, is able in the end to bring forth the son. So I think I like that. That's good. And I guess that's what's going on here too. Right? That it shows again the infinite mercy and power of God. But frankly, I have nothing better to suggest. I'm not entirely happy with that explanation. If you have a better idea of what's contained by this motif, which is very striking and very conspicuous, I'd like to hear it, if you have any more broad ideas. Okay, so that's one motif to notice. That is a motif straight through these chapters. Next big motif. The younger son ousts or takes precedence over or lords it over the older son. Right, in this society, one expects primogeniture, where the eldest son will succeed the father, inherit the land, get the title, all those things you're familiar with from Victorian novels. Right, that's true in the Hebrew Bible also. So here we have it turn things upside down slightly, where it's not the older son. The older son seems to fade away and is replaced or ousted or becomes subservient to the younger son. And here we see this motif in a number of different ways. So Isaac replaces Ishmael. Both are the sons of Abraham, the patriarch, but Isaac is the son of Sarah, the wife. Ishmael is the son of Hagar, the handmaiden, sometimes called concubine, but he's never actually called a concubine. Hagar, the handmaiden, and Isaac is the chosen son, and Ishmael is sent away. So there's our first appearance of that motif in this section of the book of Genesis. Remarkable how little is told about Isaac. I'll mention this again. We have three patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Abraham, I got lots of stories. Jacob, I have lots of stories. Isaac, I have Isaac, of course, in Genesis 22, the famous Akedah story, right? But one could argue, literally speaking, the hero of that story is not Isaac. The hero of that story is Abraham. And it's certainly part of the Abraham cycle of stories, not the Isaac cycle of stories. When Isaac finally gets the spotlight, what does he do? Almost nothing. He has a barren wife, of course. He digs some wells, argues with some Philistines, and he grows old. That's about it. So, I don't know what happened to the Isaac cycle of stories. He's the chosen son, the chosen link between Abraham and Jacob, but we hear almost as much about him as we do about Ishmael himself. So many scholars have speculated, maybe there was a cycle and it was lost, but there's something missing. I don't know what the answer is. There's something odd. But Isaac is clearly the chosen link between Abraham and Jacob. Then we come to Jacob. Jacob has his twin brother, Esau. But of course, Jacob is the younger of the twins. So, unlike Ishmael, we understand why he gets kicked out. His mother is a lower status than Isaac's mother. So perhaps that's why Ishmael gets kicked out and Isaac is retained as the chosen heir. But in the case of Jacob and Esau, that explanation won't work, because after all, they are uterine twins. They have the same mother and the same father. So what does the narrator gain by having Jacob come out and be the younger brother, who then, we have three different ways by which the narrator tries to rectify this error of nature, that Esau sneaked out of his mother's womb first, before Jacob. So the narrator tries to set things right in three different ways. Rebekah, while pregnant, receives an oracle from God that the elder will serve the younger. We have that pot of lentils story that Jacob serves up to Esau, who was famished one day coming home from the hunt, and says, "Boy, those lentils smell good." And Jacob says, "Okay, I'll give you some lentils if you give me your birthright." And Esau says, "Sure." That's the story. Again, paraphrase, but that's the story. So Esau trades his birthright for a pot of lentils. And then last is the most dramatic scene of all, the story of Jacob dressing up as his brother Esau, and to be very blunt, ladies and gentlemen, stealing the benediction from his brother by masquerading as Esau and getting the benediction for himself. So the narrator on the one hand knows that Jacob is the younger brother. Jacob is going to trump his older brother Esau. And the narrator seems very uncomfortable about this fact, even though the narrator tells us three different ways to justify, to explain how Jacob in fact triumphed over his brother Esau and pushed him aside. I don't quite get this. Again, I'm looking for a bright idea to explain what is going on in this story where the narrator knows that Jacob is the younger brother but is trying desperately to make him into the older brother. If you have a bright idea on that one, I'm looking forward to that too. The only thing I can think of here is that this mirrors our Israelite theology. Right, the link between God and Israel, as I've already mentioned, is not natural, it's constructed, it's covenantal. Right, it's a matter of, you're not born into this relationship. The relationship between the people of Israel and God is constructed. And we call that a covenant, or a brit. So here too, the firstborn son, who is the natural heir, is pushed aside by the unnatural heir, the second-born son, mirroring a covenantal relationship. This is Shaye Cohen trying to make sense out of this passage. You don't like what Shaye Cohen just said? Fine with me. Then I turn to you and I'll say, okay, you explain it. Okay, I'm going to move on ahead then, since none of you have any bright ideas. Jacob is the hero. He's the chosen son, the heir, right? The covenant that goes from Abraham to Isaac goes to Jacob. And poor Esau is left out, pushed out into the cold. He gets his own people. He gets to be the founder of the people of Edom, or Edom in Hebrew, Edom in English. Not cheese, not E-D-A-M, E-D-O-M, right? E-D-O-M, people of Edom. But clearly, that ranks lower in the eyes of the narrator than the people of Israel. And he runs off into the wilderness and does whatever he does, right? And disappears from the narrative. Esau, the character. The Edomites very much remain in the narrative. Jacob, however, is the hero, but he's often been called a trickster hero. Right? And this is discussed by Cohen. A trickster hero. He does things that you and I might say are not nice. Like stealing your brother's firstborn blessing. That's not very nice. But he does it. And the narrator has some sympathy for Esau in that wonderful scene where Esau comes back from the field and becomes Isaac, his elderly father, and says, okay, Father, I'm ready for my blessing. And then Isaac says, I guess your brother stole your blessing. And then Esau cries and says, don't you have anything left for me? It's a beautiful scene, really a wonderful scene, very affecting. But of course we know, poor Esau, he's number two, right? He's just not going to make it. Even though the narrator has sympathy for him, that sympathy does not translate into theology. Because Jacob is the hero, Jacob is the covenantal brother, who will go on to found the 12 sons of Israel, not Esau. So scholars have noticed that this narrator, whom we call Jay, right, is a master artist of narrative, creating sympathy even for the character who is going to lose. So Jacob is a trickster hero. Many scholars have observed something like Odysseus, or in the Odyssey. Namely, you have to admire the guy, even necessarily you don't like the guy. So we have this pattern. The younger son trumps the older son. Isaac trumps Ishmael. Jacob trumps Esau. And this pattern will continue, as we'll discuss in just a moment, both in Genesis and elsewhere in Scripture. That pattern, however, sort of comes to an end with the 12 sons of Jacob. You'd expect the pattern to continue. Some of those sons would be kicked out. Some of those sons would be set loose and told, go, 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 just go away. Like the Ishmaelites and the Edomites. But no, the 12 sons of Jacob, they're all there. Even though, as the narrator makes very clear, some of the sons are sons of wives, some are sons of concubines. A concubine is like a wife, only low status. That's all you need to know. Low status wife. So some are sons of concubines, some are sons of wives, and of the wives, one is the favorite wife and one is the less favorite wife. So the narrator is giving you all kinds of signals that we can establish a hierarchy among the sons. But no, Esau gets kicked out, but all the sons of Jacob somehow count, and they all turn into the 12 tribes of Israel. Now it's true, Joseph, Reuben, the firstborn, is going to blow it. Simon and Levi are going to blow it. I'm going out in order now. Reuben blows it, Simon blows it, Levi blows it, Judah. Finally got to a son who's going to emerge as the dominant son. The tribe of Judah is the royal line. The house of Judah, the house of David, is the royal, the official, approved, sanctioned, authorized, appropriate, proper royal house, the people of Israel, in the narrator of the book of Kings. Echoed all over the place in Scripture. So that we understand. So we have here something like that motif, where Judah emerges, replacing the older three sons, and then Joseph emerges as the alternative. Judah has the royal line, Joseph has prosperity, and in the narrator, Joseph, of course, becomes vizier of Egypt, and the sons all come to Egypt in that wonderful story. If you haven't read it yet, you should, right? To which the sons basically all bow down before Joseph, precisely as Joseph had predicted in his dream. So here we have echoes of that motif, the younger son replacing the older son. Echoes that motif, but doesn't play out quite the same way at all. It has a different ending completely. Then continuing briefly on that motif, we have Ephraim over Manasseh, the blessing of Genesis 48, with the wonderful painting by Rembrandt, illustrating the scene. And then this motif continues later in Scripture. Moses, the younger brother, is the leader, not Aaron, the older brother. David is the youngest of 7 brothers, and of course the top 6 will go away. I challenge you to name any of those other 6 brothers, right? Because they're nobodies. David, the youngest of the brothers, of course, is the hero who will emerge. So this is a favorite motif. So the younger brother replaces older brother. Younger son replaces older son. Another very prominent motif in these chapters of Genesis, the power of blessing, and mirror image, the power of curse. And somehow blessings have power, and similarly, curses have power. The narrator assumes that. What makes a blessing a blessing? What makes a curse a curse? The narrator does not explain. But at least in the hands of the right person, a blessing and a curse each have potency. They affect things. We see that beginning in chapter 9. I alluded to this when we read the flood story, but now I can talk about it very briefly. The first time we have the story, not that God blessing someone, but one human blessing or cursing another. So here we have Noah. So we had the flood. Noah survived the flood with his 3 sons and with their wives, and with 2 or maybe 7 sets of animals in the ark. Finally, the flood is over after a year-long duration. If you're a traditionalist exegete like Rashi, 150 days, 40 days, pick a number. All right, the flood is finally over. They come out from the ark, and what do? They establish human society, human civilization. What's the first thing, a first sign of human civilization? Liquor. Right, that's the first sign, right? So he plants a vineyard. He makes wine. He drinks. He gets drunk. This is Noah. Right there. I mean, this happens in that one paragraph at the getting out of the ark. He's already lying around in his tent drunk. As I said, Noah is not your perfect hero. Right. So that's Noah. What happens? Then comes extremely cryptic verse where it says that Ham, one of the 3 brothers, one of the 3 sons of Noah, sees his father rolling around in the tent naked, and he walks backwards so as not to look at his father, to cover up his nakedness. And then when Noah wakes up, he realizes what has been done, and he curses Canaan, son of Ham. If you're a little puzzled, don't blame me. The narrative is extremely cryptic. Extremely cryptic. I encourage you to look at it, Genesis chapter 9. Anyway, here's our first example of one human being cursing another. In this case, Noah cursing his grandson, Canaan, and seemingly also cursing Ham, although it's very confusing. Anyway, how to explain that story, I don't know. This ancient, medieval, and modern exegetes have banged their head trying to understand what's going on in those very cryptic verses. But the bottom line I do understand. The bottom line is that Canaan is cursed. Canaan owes subservience to the other brothers. Ham and his son Canaan owe subservience to the other brothers, to Shem and Yefet. So what does that mean, class? Canaan. Who's Canaan? Progenitor of people who are going to live in the land of Canaan. So the Canaanites. So the Canaanites subservient to the Israelites, who are the descendants from Shem? Yes. Okay, I'll help you out. Yes. The Canaanites, stole the land of Israel. The way now later exegetes will try to figure out how did the Canaanites get there to begin with. The Canaanites were never meant to have the land of Canaan. It's a mistake. It's an oversight. It's some aberration. Anyway, it doesn't matter, because the Canaanites are under Noah's curse, such that whatever they have, they're subservient to the Israelites who come from the line of Shem. Surely, at least that much we can say about that curse. Those verses will have a great deal of mischief in human history, because as you may well know, when it comes to the slave trade, those verses of the curse of Noah on Ham and Canaan were understood to be the curse of Africans or blacks from the line of Ham. And those verses were then trotted out as biblical warrant for the enslavement of the dark-skinned peoples. Now we're in very deep waters, right? But all that's not Noah's fault or the narrator's fault in the book of Genesis. I'm just explaining what happens as you move forward. Okay. There's a curse. And that curse is effective. Then you have the blessing. You have Isaac's blessing of Jacob. And even though Isaac thinks that the person before him is Esau, nonetheless, the blessing is effective because he says it. So apparently a blessing has some independent potency, independent validity, independent of the intention of the blessor. I'm not sure how to explain that either, but there it is. That motif is very conspicuous in the book of Genesis. So when Esau comes in and says, "Dad, don't you have a blessing for me?" Isaac says, I gave your brother all the blessings. What do I have left for you? I have, crumbs. All right, I'll take it. All right, so Esau gets second-tier blessings. As if the blessing itself has power just in its own words. A very striking motif. Then we get to Jacob blessing the sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. And here we have that switcheroo. He takes his right hand and puts it on the head of the younger brother, and his left hand on the older brother, because the younger brother is going to be more powerful than the older brother. Well, that motif I recognize already. But here again we have the same blessing motif. And then finally we have in Genesis 49, Jacob blesses the 12 sons, his 12 sons, who are understood to be the 12 tribes. I'll come back to that in just a moment. So this is a very prominent motif. Blessings and curses seem to be effective, have potency, independent of the intention of the blessor. Just the words themselves work. Don't know how to explain this exactly, but there it is in the book of Genesis. Once again, bright ideas are earnestly solicited, if you have any, to explain these sets of motifs. These are striking motifs. As you read the book of Genesis, you'll see these things, and they should strike you as odd, as interesting, as requiring comment. Well, that's the artistry of the narrator, right? Jay. We all know that Jacob is the good guy. We, the readers, know that the 12 sons of Jacob are going to become the 12 sons of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, people of Israel, and that's who we are, the readers. Who's reading this? The narrator knows that this is so, and yet we, the readers, know that this is so, and yet the narrator plays with this, right? It plays with this. So it's not a stray case of Isaac blessing Jacob. He could have done that. Boring, right? Much more interesting this way, right? He intends to bless Esau, but Rebecca, the mother, who likes Isaac better, Jacob better, gets him to dress up like Esau. Now you have a story. Now you have a wonderful story. Yes, we understand. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because Jacob is obviously the chosen successor, the bearer of the covenant, the chosen son, the one with the blessing. But the narrator has this extraordinary way to get there. So is it just art? Narrative art? Question mark? Does that explain the whole thing? That's where I'm not 100% sure. And the implicit message is Isaac's blessing will be effective and potent no matter, even though Isaac thinks he's blessing Esau, it still applies to Jacob. I think that's interesting. Okay, thank you. Great suggestions. Great suggestions. So let's move along. Next motif. Sometimes this is discussed by Kugel. Sometimes the sons, Abraham, Isaac, and now it comes to the sons of Jacob, the 12 sons. Sometimes these stories seem to be about these individuals. I mean, you have a cycle of stories about the sons of Jacob, at least about some of them. Other times it seems clear that while we're talking about a son, namely an individual man, what we're really talking about is the tribe. Each of these 12 sons are the eponymous ancestors of tribes or peoples. Eponymous, that's a good word. Right, what does eponymous mean? Anyway, eponymous, so these are eponymous ancestors. These ancestors bestow their name upon. Their later successors. So Judah is the eponymous ancestor of the tribe of Judah. Levi is the eponymous ancestor of the tribe of Levi. Okay, etc., etc. So sometimes there are individuals, story, and sometimes it seems the narrator knows that you, the reader, know that these individuals are not individuals at all. They are stand-ins. They are the eponymous ancestors for tribes. So here it's very clear. I'm giving you some examples in the lecture notes. So the offspring of Ishmael, we're told that Ishmael is a stand-in for tribes. We give a list of the tribes. And these are, later on, will come to be called Arab tribes, called Arabs. The Arabs trace their ancestry back to Ishmael. Right, discuss details some other time. Rebecca's oracle has the two sons, namely the two sons of Jacob and Esau, fighting with each other in the womb, clearly represent Jacob and the sons of Jacob and the sons of Esau, Edomites, struggle between Edomites and Israelites. Most striking is the phrase children of Israel, which in context might mean the 12 sons of Jacob, since Israel is another name for Jacob, at least in that story which conflates. There are two different versions of that, of which Jacob gets the name Israel. So the children of Israel, but in the context in chapter 32, doesn't mean the 12 sons of Jacob, it means the people of Israel. Well, later on, people who are called the children of Israel, namely the people of Israel, namely Israelites. Esau is Edom, blessing of Jacob. This is most striking in the Jacob's blessing, in Genesis chapter 49, where Jacob is blessing his 12 sons. Jacob, on his deathbed, is blessing his 12 sons, but the reader knows within 2 seconds that these are not the sons who are getting blessed, rather it's the tribes. Jacob here on his deathbed is laying out for you the subsequent history of these 12 tribes. So, Reuben, you did something terrible. You lost the firstborn status. Simon and Levi, you also did something terrible. So, you're not going to get any land, Simon and Levi. You're going to be scattered and disappear. Well, Simon, that does happen to the tribe of Reuben. Reuben is a very weak and powerless tribe in later history. He disappears. The tribe of Reuben disappears. The tribe of Simeon also disappears. Another weak tribe. And this song of Jacob is explaining why. Because their ancestors did something terrible, such that they will wind up being powerless and invisible. Levi is more complicated. Levi also does not get land. He's an unlanded tribe, but Levi, in some mysterious process, the Levites turn into the hieratic or priestly class, people of Israel. People who serve in the central sanctuary, people who serve at altars, people who will later on become the aristocracy in Jerusalem. Jews named Cohen, right, are from the tribe of Levi. Or if your name is Levi, or Levi, or Halevi, or Levitas, or Levitan, right, you're all from the tribe of Levi, where somehow, even though you have no land, you nonetheless emerge as an aristocracy of sorts. How that happened, we don't know. There's something hidden here from us. Simeon loses land and disappears. Levi loses land and emerges as the priestly class in ancient Israel. Key point. Genesis 49 does not yet know that Levi is the priestly class. Jacob, blessing his sons, says, Simeon and Levi, the two of you are both hotheads. I can't stand to be with you. Go away. That's a loose paraphrase of what Jacob says. And Simeon does go away. Simeon disappears. The tribe of Levi endures. Then finally we get to Judah, the next son in line. Judah, you get the royal scepter. So the royal power belongs to Judah. Then we skip a little bit down. Then we get to Joseph. And Joseph, here again, not the two sons, but just one, not Manasseh and Ephraim, but Joseph. Joseph gets money. He's going to get prosperity, right? Everything will do. This is a prosperous tribe. So here we have 12 sons, but we understand these are not sons at all. Jacob here on his deathbed is predicting, or should I say, predicting, wink, wink, right, is predicting the future history of the 12 tribes. Pointing out that some are destined for fame, fortune, and power, and others are destined to disappear or to be weak and fundamentally invisible in the later history of Israel. Okay, so sometimes a son is a son, and sometimes a son is a tribe. Sometimes individual is an individual in the book of Genesis, and sometimes individual is a stand-in for a whole people. Okay, now we come to the Joseph narrative. Any questions, observations? Okay, the narrative function, the function of the Joseph narrative, the book of Genesis, is to explain how the Israelites wind up in Egypt. Because you can't have a great exodus from Egypt unless you're in Egypt. So how do the Israelites get to Egypt? Huh? Good question. Answer. The Joseph narrative fills in that key link. So you have a people who come from Mesopotamia, who come from Ur, or maybe it's Haran, I'm not sure, comes from somewhere over in the east, what we call now Iraq, right? Migrated to the land of Canaan. Then they're going to migrate out to Egypt, and then they're going to come back. That's the very complicated story that we're told. So the narrative function of the Joseph story is to get the sons of Israel out of the land of Canaan into Egypt, where they can be then enslaved and then have a mighty redemption. That's Wednesday. Having said that, though, the story is a lot more than just that. You could have told that story in a chapter. Instead, you have this whole long, wonderful, wonderful novella, right, which full of characters and full of artistic narration. Everybody loves the story of Joseph. Everybody loves that dramatic moment when Joseph reveals the great secret to his brothers and says, I am Joseph, is Dad still alive? Wonderful, wonderful scene. Beautiful, beautiful line. So everybody likes the story. I challenge you to read it and not like the Joseph story. We also agree, as we modern Bible scholars read very carefully, there are some bumps or seams in the narrative here too. So on the handout you have some information about it. But we pay no attention to that because the artistry is such that we can gloss over these bumps or seams in the narrative. The Joseph story is a very prominent set of themes. It has to do with dreams. Right? The story launches with dreams in chapter 37. Right? Joseph says to his brothers and to his father, hey, guys, let me tell you a dream I had. Ugh, mistake. Keep the dreams to yourself. But no, Joseph says, let me tell you about this great dream I had. Then I got another dream. And of course, he's thoroughly obnoxious, right? And arouses the envy and hatred of his brothers. And while Dad mulls it over, it says, Dad is mulling over, realizing that these dreams are not just dreams, these are portents of some dramatic future events. like a blessing and a curse. If you're a certain person of a certain status, a dream is not just the exquisites of your subterranean subconscious and your id and Freud, etc. No. These are messages. These are portents. These are omens for the future. Again, not everybody. If you're a Shlemiel, you just have a dream. But if you're Joseph, then your dreams mean something. So, and the story then is launched. The key moment, of course, in the story is that Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. So, the ability to interpret dreams seems to loom large for this narrator. That's a striking characteristic of this set of stories. Joseph winds up, of course, as Viceroy of Egypt. And many people have noticed that this is sort of paradigmatic of certain kinds of the diaspora experience of later Israelites and later Jews. Right? So on the one hand, they're very prosperous. Viceroy of Egypt is pretty good, I would say. Right? On the other hand, it comes at a great cost. Joseph is highly Egyptianized. He gets an Egyptian name. He gets an Egyptian wife. When his own brothers come to town, they don't recognize him. They don't realize that this is Joseph because he's been thoroughly blended into Egyptian culture. He gives his sons names, Menashe and Ephraim. I have forgotten where I come from, and I am flourishing in my new land. Those are the names of his two sons. So clearly he is, at least many later Jews read this character as a kind of paradigmatic diaspora Jewish character who leaves his homeland and people behind and somehow strikes root in a new land and prospers there. Another way to read the story, it's a courtier story. It's a story about an Israelite who rises and prospers in the court of a foreign king. This is a motif we'll recognize later in Scripture. The book of Esther is built around this theme, as is the book of Daniel, your favorite book, right? The book of Daniel, where again we have a series of men who prosper at the court of a foreign king. Many scholars have noticed this connection between the Joseph story, book of Esther, and the book of Daniel. So much so, perhaps it's been suggested they may even come from the same place, in the sense of the same origins. The same storytellers who told the one will wind up telling the other. Or maybe there's some connection in date between them. I don't know. This is very complicated. We don't know the date of these things. But maybe there's conscious imitation by the narrators of Daniel and Esther of the story in Joseph. Last two quick observations. For the narrator, not only is Joseph Viceroy of Egypt, but for the narrator it's important that Joseph is a cultural hero. Namely, what's the origin of the land tax system in Egypt? Answer, Joseph invented it. Our man, our boy, Joseph, Israelite. Right? He is responsible for setting up the land tax system in Egypt, wherein the Pharaoh owns all the land. Peasants do not own land. No one owns land except the Pharaoh, and except for the priests of temples. They own land. Otherwise, no one owns land. Who came up with this amazing system? Joseph. So it's important to the narrator that you realize that Joseph is important not just for Israelite history, but for world history. Next interesting point, the narrator nowhere explains that all this doing is God's work. Surely, this is meant to be understood implicitly, how God's mysterious hand is at work throughout, from those initial obnoxious dreams of Joseph down to the very end where he dies in Egypt as Viceroy of Egypt, right? That this amazing story, this rags to riches story, right, is a story of showing the unseen hand of God at work. The interesting point is the narrator nowhere says this. That it's all implicit. There's just one moment in the narrative where the characters, the brothers, Joseph says to his brothers, now you understand why you sold me into slavery. Now you understand why I was enslaved, went down to Egypt, imprisoned, released, and became Viceroy of Egypt. All for this moment. It was all God's hand so that everything will turn out okay. But that's the figures within the story reflecting on the Joseph story. The narrator himself steps back and simply tells this beautiful story in this beautiful way and lets you, the reader, tease out the implicit message of the story. But it is implicit throughout. Maybe that is part of the secret of the story. Its power is precisely because it is subtle. And leaves it for you, the reader, to figure out what the message of the story is. Okay, everyone, our time is up. Hope to see you on Wednesday.